Hello everyone. And it's a small group, but then we are going to put this out on our YouTube channel and everybody else can watch it. So, you're joining Chat Masala. It's a guest lecture series, highlights the honors designers from South Asian diaspora around the globe. Chaat masala is an omnipresent mixture of spices that creates an unforgettable explosion of flavors. So, this series intends to memorialize the dynamic South Asian designers and educators who center South Asian design histories and social and cultural narratives in their creative endeavors. So, I'm Archana Shekhara. I'm the chair and founder of Sadhya, and thank you for joining us. I'm pleased and extremely delighted to introduce Professor Arti Sandhu, who's currently an associate professor in the fashion program in the School of Design at DAP, University of Cincinnati. Her research is centered on contemporary Indian fashion and related design culture. She's the author of Indian Fashion, Tradition, Innovation, Style, and it was published by Bloomsbury Press in 2015. She has also published articles on the contemporary Indian catwalk, craft and sustainable design practices, sari groups on social media, television, soap opera costumes, and drag queens. Arti is currently working on research projects relating to the growing discourse around decolonizing fashion studies, the role of craft can play in fashion sustainable design practices, and an ongoing digital ethnography on social media sari groups. Arti also occasionally writes for the digital fashion publication, The Voice of Fashion. Arti, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time very generously. We really appreciate it.
Oh, no, thank you for the invitation. And also thank you to Mohammed, who I know isn't here, but I know will watch the recording, who invited me originally. And I'm really excited to be part of this group. And also for your warmth, Archana, because you said something the other day that hasn't sort of left my mind of being, a design educator, but sort of a sense of loneliness that you feel outside of South Asia. And I've often talk to people who said they have, mentors and sort of collaborators in their writing, and I always wondered why I didn't have one. And then I realized, you're often the only one in that space, teaching design, but the things that you're kind of thinking about don't really kind of have weight in the space you're teaching in sometimes. So that was very, what you said kind of made me feel less weird about myself for a minute. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and hopefully I share the right one because you know how, even though we're all used to this method, mistakes happen. I'm hoping you can see a slide that says lessons more. Awesome.
Yes, yes.
Um, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, my main talk is about minimalism in contemporary fashion, but I'm going to start by just sort of giving a little bit of an introduction to add to the introduction you gave. Um, I am trained as a designer. I went to NIFT in the 97 2000 batch, and I mentioned this because NIFT at that time and then also NID both have played very central roles in training designers for India's emerging at that time fashion industry. And then, of course, other parts of design. I did a master's in the UK after that, and while en route to going back to my design job in Delhi, I sort of was very fortunate to get a job teaching fashion in New Zealand, which is how I sort of fell into this unintended profession of teaching. Um, and it was sort of a difficult moment because as a fashion designer, I couldn't practice fashion in New Zealand, not being familiar with the framework and setup and not even knowing who I was as a designer. And so I sort of did these kind of early visual experiments, which, will kind of resonate with some people. They're sort of trying to explore identity and home. I think these are sort of common diasporic themes that kind of come about. And then sort of going back to photography and textile, um, that were my familiar tools and familiar kind of things that I enjoyed to do. Uh, while I was doing this in New Zealand, oops, sorry, my slides have decided they don't want to work. I realized that instead of being a practicing designer, I wanted to write about design and clothing because I wasn't seeing enough about Indian fashion. I saw a lot about costume, but not enough about everyday clothing and identity politics in dress. And so I started close to home and did some work on interviewing women in the Indian diaspora in New Zealand, but then realized that home in my mind was still very much India. And so I started literally researching close to home and began sort of looking at first, just South Delhi fashion, which this was sort of my first kind of academic exploration into fashion at the time. And which made me realize that being a child of the 80s and early 90s, I had unknowingly witnessed a very major change through liberalization in India, where the markets changed, but also the environment changed significantly. And I was very fortunate to be a student at NIFT at the time. The first fashion weeks were starting, global brands were coming in, and there was this sort of real excitement about what is Indian design, Indian fashion. So I fell headlong into a very unprepared book project that I learned through. I really didn't know what I was doing, but I think by the end of it, I knew what the book was about. And my focus became fashion in the post-liberalization period, looking at design culture, everyday dress, clothing, sort of politics of dress, but really focusing on some of the ways in which the past was being reinterpreted in contemporary design through references to the colonial period, nationalism, and sort of these orientalist or re-orientalist frameworks. Um, and while I was doing that, I also shifted my own creative practice to some sort of form of illustration. But most recently now, I've also taken on a new avatar of being a social media influencer and looking at craft, clothing, and fashion on social media. But that's a completely different space. So following my book project, as you mentioned, have worked on a number of smaller, more deeper dives into fashion in India and fashion from India. And one of the things that I continued to hear was this rhetoric around sustainability and well-being. And it was something that I was very eager to explore because it was also being sort of couched in a colonial framework. And that is where today's talk comes from. Um, this idea of minimalist fashion, which was emerging in the 2010s and is now, no longer a trend, but very much part of Indian fashion. But this sort of idea that less is more, and as we like to say in India, it's good for you. And so really questioning what this good for you part meant. Um, so my goal is to talk about that. But for I guess kind of those who have some familiarity with Indian fashion, um, the word minimalism would come as maybe some sort of a surprise because minimalism and Indian fashion in a popular sense are not often discussed in the same breath. Um, it is often a more ornamental, more embellished style of fashion that emerged in the early 2000s that tends to get more interest. And the slide here shows you um, the recent exhibition of India in fashion that was part of the Nita Ambani Cultural Center opening exhibit. And again, it sort of emphasizes that very sort of bold, ornate, pink, red, colorful style of fashion that has received a lot of academic interest from myself included. So to speak of a more minimal proposal then seems like an anomaly or contradiction. Um, but in the last 2 decades, uh, it became very clear over these 20 years or so that there were a number of quote unquote younger emerging labels like Eka, Bodice Romango, and 1111, whose scarf you see here, who were shunning that stereotype of visual exuberance that Indian couture had already established. So my aim is to talk about the emergence of that minimalist trend and the claims that designers in that space were making about sustainability, about craft consciousness, about well-being, and still maintaining their anti-colonial, decolonial stances. Um, and then also through talking about this fashion, highlighting some of the contradictions that arise when we look at this kind of design. So I'll begin by focusing on two contemporary brands, both who I've come to know quite well, Eka by Reena Singh and Bodice by Ruchika Sachdev. And they offer both very distinct aesthetics, but at the same time are centered around very similar themes of sartorial and material austerity, and are connected to India's Khadi movement and nationalist movement and sort of pre-colonial craft um, aesthetics. Um, so I'll begin by talking about their design philosophies and describe some of their work, and you'll see that in the slides as well, and then talk more broadly about minimalist designers, their claims, and the sort of ultimate paradox that comes from researching such fashion. Um, I'm also very aware that my focus is on elite high fashion, and it's deliberate because it is this market segment that continues to be a key site where issues of identity, craft, sustainability, and nationhood are at most at stake and also on display. And another reason also being that the image of fashion for not only a city or designer, but an entire nation holds a lot of cultural capital. And so being recognized as having fashion, as having fashion weeks, fashion capital, um, then also lead to a lot of cultural and economic capital as well, and benefits, all of the organizations associated with it. So it's not only the image, but also has other benefits. So I'm going to begin by talking about Eka, that the recent tagline for the brand is Clothing for Poets, launched in 2010 by Reena Singh. And the brand is all about the simplicity of artisanal textiles. And sorry, this is Reena in her studio in Noida. The brand is centered around designing familiar and comforting clothing. She sees herself as a textile specialist through her own training and her experience, having worked with a number of crafts and taught a number of workshops. In the handloom space. And Rina insists that she doesn't design or look for fabrics based on trends. Instead, her focus is creating her own textiles, and she works with a number of regional handloom clusters across India, developing a variety of khadi cottons, wools, linens, silks, and then a blend of these. Stripes and checks are her brand's trademark. And over the decades, she's developed a number of signature weaves with ikat and jamdani, and then also worked with government organizations to benefit those craft communities. She also works with some amount of embellishment through block prints and embroideries and laces as well in her studio in Noida. So one of her trademarks, which again now sort of exists in a lot of other similar brands in this design space, is, as you can see on this slide, the selvage that one sees in handloom fabrics, which often tends to be a little sort of piece of contrast color, where when you look closely, you can see where the sort of nails of the loom hold the warp in place, or the weft and the warp in place. And oftentimes that selvage may be the only color detail in her garments. Um, Rina sees her contribution to the design and development of artisanal textiles as a vital part of their preservation and sees her work as critical for the continued relevance of these textiles for modern consumers. And this emancipatory discourse echoes that of a number of feminist craft activists like Pupul Jayakar and Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, who following independence, insisted that Indian textile crafts mattered in cultural terms, both for preserving heritage, but also as a form of popular expression. Um, and so this viewpoint is widely disseminated in Eka's promotional materials in her lookbooks, in the lectures she gives on social media, and as a form of story marketing. That is a strategy that is often used in other cultural fields like wine and sort of tourism to emphasize the importance of a region, its origin, to be able to communicate and enhance a product's value. And you see that a lot across this style of design. Now it's very popular. So aside from an emphasis on textile craft and handloom, Rina describes her collections as comprising of classic cuts that can be worn in multiple ways and are comfortable on the female body. And she designs menswear in this way as well. So her label tends to comprise of loosely cut garments that can be worn as separates, but often seen layered. Um, she sees this as a timeless wardrobe, dresses with generous gathers, numerous pleats, yards and yards of fabric with amorphous shapes, fullness are some of her key silhouettes. Over these, she designs a number of loose linen organza over dresses or wrappers that can be worn to add more layers. And then under these clothes are additional layers in the form of loose pants or cropped pants that resemble almost a salwar kameez if you were to sort of look at it in that way. Uh, Farina, the inspiration of these shapes, she says, comes from her memories of growing up in Saharanpur in UP and her childhood, witnessing the simplicity and crafts that she saw her mother and her grandmother practice. She often says that her grandmother's saris that were very plain, weathered, and worn and comfortable remain a lifelong source of inspiration for her brand. And as a result, she tries to bring those types of colors, wrinkled pastel shades into her collections and domestic textiles with ginghams, for example. Um, During our informal conversations in her studio, Rena would often talk about the challenges of designing minimalist clothing, especially in the early years, in a space where oftentimes ornamentation meant value, and her sort of trying to avoid those kind of stereotypical blingy embellishments, but at the same time finding herself bound by those stereotypes. So she sort of was forced to develop her own approach to ornamentation, whether it was simple embroideries, subtle florals using ginghams, lace, and so on and so forth. And these examples or these designs not only channel her memory of pre-liberalization, post-independence India, but also borrow details from colonial crafts and sort of elements of European dress, like lace collars, Peter Pan necklines, bows, that also influenced Indian women's clothing during the colonial era. Um, Rena often uses the word pastoral to refer to her garments, that is seen in the sort of peasant-like aesthetic that in the styling of her collections, as well as her promotional materials that are often photo shoots set in meadows, rural areas, natural, untouched landscapes, or non-urban settings. So in aged streets, small homes in small towns, or sometimes in grand havelis and bungalows. Um, and the words and images in her lookbooks romanticize these spaces. Um, so, for example, You can see here on this slide for her Summer 24 collection that is photographed in Kohima in Nagaland. She's talking about the space and the landscape and the location and romanticizing about how one encounters people and how they live. And you can see the insides of someone's house, a very modest space, but oftentimes local women are seen wearing her clothes as models as part of her collection. Uh, Similarly, her winter collection in 2023 was photographed in Ladakh, and again, a sort of a similar kind of story marketing around this location. In 21, her collection was photographed in Shillong, an excursion into the sublimity of this countryside. In 2019, the collection Aru was photographed in Srinagar and promoted as an unsaid fairy tale, a tale of Kashmir of young girls who lived a day in with abandon. So in this manner, Reena is seen romanticizing a version of India um, that is a stark contrast to the urban spaces where she lives, like Noida, and works, or where her customers reside. And you could say in many cases, this vision of India no longer exists, or perhaps never existed beyond the imagination of that designer. Um, Through Eka, um, uh, Reena presents a style of Indian minimalism and a marketing discourse that has gained significant popularity over the past few years. So, similar styles of clothing, words, photo shoots are commonplace now for many emerging brands. So I'm going to move now from talking about Reena's brand Eka to the next brand. That is quite different aesthetically, but still within this minimalist space that is Bodice by Ruchika Sachdeva. Um, so in contrast to Reena's very fluid shapes and handcrafted textures, Ruchika's label Bodice, that was founded in 2011, offers crisp cuts that borrow the aesthetic perhaps more heavily from menswear than from women's traditional styles. Ruchika credits her childhood and experience of growing up in West Delhi as a key influence on her design sensibilities. And in a conversation we had a number of years ago, she talked about a memory of wearing a starched, boxy school uniform. I'm sure those of us who grew up in India probably remember that very unfashionable garment. But for her, and a garment that was, purposefully unremarkable in design and structure for modesty and decorum. But for Ruchika, this became sort of a very key influence and a signature, and helped her develop her early design voice. The word or the name bodice for the brand comes from the first pattern making block that students in design are taught. And so the aim of the brand is sort of returning to these basics, drawing inspiration from basic shapes of clothing. Um, and observing her collections, or at least her earlier collections, they often reminded me of clerical staff uniforms and the very sort of dusty color of men's clothing that one would remember was worn throughout India in the 80s, 90s, and you could say it even now. And here is sort of an example of that very sort of basic quality of clothing. Um, and this is evident in what she designs, mostly separates, shirts, pleated pants, vests, some skirts and dresses, but also in the color palette that her collections tend to prefer: monochromatic, browns, deep reds, blacks, navies, and whites. Um, and the fit of her clothing tends to be relaxed and boxy, with some color blocking, and sort of a very kind of looseness of shape. The austerity and restraint in these garments seems to echo themes pertaining to material restraint and fiscal responsibility that were drilled into middle class mindsets prior to India's liberalization, and I, for one, remember them well. Um, and this was also a period which was of Ruchika's early childhood, the 80s, when there was still relative stability when it came to the inequality between different classes of Indian society. While there was inequality, it was different to what there is now. And so Ruchika found this moment inspiring due to not only the clothing styles that were, not ostentation, but also the beliefs and of that moment in Indian history. In addition to her trademark boxy shapes and color blocking, Sachdeva, Ruchika also developed a style of bias-bound pleats that you see here. Um, that in 2018 she won the prestigious Woolmark International Women's Wear Award for, which again is a very high prestige for a South Asian designer. And these bias bound pleats on the surface provide visual interest. So rather than overt ornamentation, they are both structural and create visual interest, and are now a central feature of the brand that she says is inspired heavily by geometry and the clean lines of post-colonial Indian modernist art and architecture. So once again, we see references to a period before liberalization, now not so much about clothing, but a moment when modern Indian design and architecture facilitated a meeting of both modern technology and indigenous methods. Uh, this inspiration is also evident in the design of bodices, retail store and studio that you see here on the left, that features an open plan with large windows, natural wood, concrete, bamboo blinds, materials that were common to homes. At least I remember them everywhere in Delhi during the 80s and 90s. And of course, sadly, now they're all being torn down. But, homes like the one you see on the right that has recently been restored. Um, Bodices collections are also made from sustainable fabrics that fuse, for example, khadi cotton or merino wool with handloom weaves. And so, just like Reena, Ruchika also develops these textiles by traveling to remote rural areas to collaborate with weavers and dyers and various craft clusters. However, the aesthetic outcomes, as you can see, are quite different. So, Aka's brand identity and design ethos were linked to more romantic memories of rural settings. Um, Bodice evokes an inspiration from urban spaces. But both these designers and both these brands, through their design innovations, return to an imaginary past. And in Ruchika's case, it's from India's protectionist economy period following independence, before the sort of boom of economic liberalization. So I'm going to zoom out from talking about these two brands and just talk briefly about the more sort of stereotype or the popular image of Indian fashion that these minimalist designers were seen to be in contrast to, and some would say were deliberately against. So in the 2000s, we saw the emergence of Indian couture, handcrafted, hand embellished, made to measure garments by craft revivalist designers like Ritu Kumar, you see here. Uh, and then other more sort of royalists like J.J. Valaya, Tarun Teheliani, and Sabyasachi Mukherjee. These designers incorporated and revived not only historical styles of dress, but also textiles and embellishments. The clothing that became popular resembled traditional garments and drew from langas, cholis, ghagras, saris, as well as mixed them with westernized versions of the same. Um, and textile crafts, as well as traditional dress practices, played a critical role in this very cohesive design identity. And a key part of this design identity was also reference to re-orientalist themes, references to India's pre-colonial past. You can see here in Sabyasachi's couture collection, reference to the colonial sari, as well as selective references to the Khadi movement, the Swadeshi movement, all to create a very vivid celebration of Indianness through couture. And during my early field research in the late 2000s and early 2010s, a number of designers in personal conversations would express their frustration um, and inability to design unembellished designer clothes. So at that time, according to my friend and college colleague Gaurav Gupta, it was maximalism that was the required aesthetic. Um, at this time, uh, this a similar, not so much maximalism, but there were similar celebrations of vernacular Indian elements in more broadly beyond fashion. And William Mazzarella, talking about the advertising industry, specifically proposed the term new Swadeshi for this style of design. That was not entirely against Western influences, but also claimed to have the same aim as Gandhi's Swadeshi movement, to assert a unique, independent national identity. Because remember, design, and in the case of fashion, has significant cultural capital, global cultural capital. So, but beyond the reference to the Swadeshi movement, aesthetically, ornamental Indian couture bore very little resemblance to the actual clothing or fabrics worn during the Swadeshi movement. So instead, the preferred sartorial style emphasized visual opulence, material access, and often also kitschy fusions of Indian and Western elements, made very popular by designers like Manish Arora, for example. So, of course, the designers that I'm speaking of in this sort of emergence of minimalist fashion then come about as a complete contrast, and their work was driven by a desire to challenge those established stereotypes of a more ornamental style of couture. Now, this challenge is not only a logical turn of the fashion pendulum, which, if you think about how the fashion system works, it thrives on opposites. So if there is an ornamental style, it is most likely that there would be in the near future a non-ornamental style. So part of this emergence of minimalism was a simple kind of moving of the fashion cycle. But at that time, it was also a shift from a culture of identity creation that had previously been centered around conspicuous consumption, that was very popular amongst the rising middle classes and elites soon after liberalization. So there had been a real shift from that need for conspicuous consumption. Um, Furthermore, the moment had, or neoliberal globalization had also slowly led to the image of a new liberal Indian woman, who was constantly evolving. And these emerging designers were keen to propose alternatives for who and what this woman was and what she should wear. She was seen as a confident, liberal, modern consumer, but was still looking to dress according to social norms and needed modest clothes. And this is where designers like Rina and Ruchika immersed themselves by suggesting that their own sartorial needs and experiences were informing their own collections. And you can see a quote from Ruchika, saying how she knew that there was a customer like her out there, and she needed to design a wardrobe to support that customer. So by wearing their own clothing, they were affirming the relevance for such fashion, but also in their promotional materials, inviting women, successful women like themselves from design and creative professions, to wear their clothes. To be able to show how they were designing practical yet stylish and relevant clothing for women like themselves. And then beyond that, the timing was also perfect. There were a number of these designers returning from degrees from overseas, like LCF, Central St. Martin's, returning with a global experience, and then beginning to look at Indian textiles from quote unquote fresh eyes. So there are a number of claims that minimalist fashion makes, and I'm going to rush through them, and before I come to the sort of paradoxes in these claims. So a key, and there are a number of designers in this space, like 1111, Lovebirds, whose work features on a number of slides, and Raw Mango, and I mean the list is endless now. And most of these labels design basics that stick to classic cuts. So, simple tunics, dresses, trousers, salwar kameezes, and saris has sort of become the benchmark of this minimalist style. Um, and in all of these clothing, there is significant attention to detail. Um, and most of these incorporate some textile craft, whether it's khadi or handloom, or minimal ornamentation, and crafts that designers insist, and minimalism that they insist has always been the hallmark of Indian textiles. Um, and in some ways, you could say that minimalist designers also follow the same ethos as the more ornamental couture designers, relying on a similar discourse, but the aesthetic outcomes are very different. Um, and one of the differences is in their marketing discourse and promotional material is that minimalist clothing, simple clothing and minimalist aesthetics are seen to be more authentic, more deeply rooted in the design and function of traditional textiles in India. Um, and again, sorry, I need to see what my next slide is. Yes. And this viewpoint is affirmed by a number of textile and craft experts who claim that handcrafted products were naturally purposeful and naturally simple and beautiful for that purpose, and met the needs of people at the time. Um, this appreciation for Indian craftsmanship was also echoed in the recommendation of the infamous Ames India report. That was commissioned by Jawaharlal Nehru in the late 50s, that spoke about, responding to the values that exist in commonplace things and designing in response to the history of the people, its land, its local resources. So the current discourse around minimalist fashion in India promotes revisiting these recommendations as a solution. For moving away from a kitschy, blingy visual aesthetic and designing a more authentic product. Through their promotion of khadi and handloom and artisanal crafts, these designers continue to foreground Gandhian principles. But not only are they foregrounding the principles, but also making visual references to the simple clothing worn by people in this time period and also promoted by Gandhi himself. Um, Again, to substantiate the cultural relevance of their minimalist products. The other sort of claim here that Indian fashion designers continue to make is connecting craft to sustainability, and then that to individual and collective well-being. We know that in globally, craft is linked to the broader conversation on sustainable design. It's recognized as a value-adding mechanism. It's makes handcrafted items become more valuable to own, have sort of material joy, preciousness, and so allow us to be more engaged and value them for longer. Um, and there's the belief that all of these qualities of handcrafted items make fashion less disposable. And so within the context of Indian design, these viewpoints are a dominant discourse around sustainable fashion and the use of local craft. Um, and again, echo the decades of discourse around craft from textile craft proponents like Chattopadhyay, who you see quoted here, who talks about how India is a nation of craftspeople, and craft is more than just a skill, but more of a sort of emotional, spiritual, embodied activity. Similarly, Gandhi also promoted this romanticized viewpoint in the value and practicing of a craft like khadi, spinning and weaving. So when, sorry, so when uh, minimalist designers emphasize the purity of handloom, they're singling out one or two key details of the textile or a garment and aligning themselves with this discourse of sustaining Indian crafts and then sort of creating this broader sense of well-being. But here is where the first paradox emerges when we consider that the complexities of working with textile crafts and craftspeople situated in rural spaces to create luxury fashion. So contemporary designers and craft proponents see strong value in developing handcrafts, but remains an uneven power dynamic between the designer and the craftsperson, and in this current moment, a broadening chasm between these two groups because of neoliberal market forces. So we see the emergence of a form of philanthrocapitalism where craftspeople, on one hand, are indispensable not only for their skills and representation of Indian culture, but also for their impoverishment that needs to be maintained, but also socially uplifted to be able to promote the role of the designer as a benevolent patron. Beyond this, another paradox that emerges in the way minimalist fashion is promoted to its customers is that minimalist designers tend to speak of being anti-consumption, anti-fast fashion. They promote their style of clothing that is oversized, layered, made of high-quality textiles as a way to design garments that have long-term wear. And romanticize more sustainable practices that they claim were part of pre-liberalization, pre-independence periods. But even as minimalist designers attempt to subvert colonial and capitalist frameworks, they're also bound by the same frameworks of trends, planned obsolescence, and this need or logic of growth to continue to grow their brands. So even as they promote anti-consumption or less consumption, they still need to continue to create more and more collections and new collections for their consumers to continue to buy into. The next paradox, and perhaps the most complicated one, in my opinion, is how is where minimalism tends to, or minimalist designers tend to promote their work in line with good taste, and good taste in the sense that the product they offer has a sort of a purest, authentic element. Um, and when you sort of think about good taste and good consumption patterns, and then you look at the price points these labels retail at, which tends to be anything in excess of about $100 to $150 to about $900 to $1,000 per item in India, you begin to see that minimalist designers are romanticizing the patina of well-worn clothes or tastefulness of everyday dress. But on the other side, they're also foregrounding that deep class divide and a polarity between India's rich and poor. And you begin to realize that this sense of well-being then can only be afforded by those who can buy into this kind of clothing. And within that paradox, uh, um, is that also that ornamentation in India was not only a hallmark of Indian couture, but also flourishes amongst the aspiring middle classes and the lower laboring classes. Um, so indirectly, minimalist fashion's critique of loud ostentation clothing also becomes a critique of popular tastes and India's popular classes. And this and is in some ways not too dissimilar. This put down is not too dissimilar from the way Mahatma Gandhi romanticized khadi and simple clothing made from quote unquote country cloth, which also disparaged popular tastes for ornamentation and regional textiles, especially amongst women, and ultimately did harm some of the handloom weaves at that time. So as a to draw this talk to a conclusion and sort of keeping all these paradoxes in mind, one question arises. Are minimalist luxury garments really better for you, as the designers and the contemporary proponents claim that they are? Because on one hand, minimalist fashion is caught between these ambivalences of decolonial design practices that are uplifting craft, foregrounding Gandhian values, and emphasizing sustainable consumption, anti-consumption patterns. But on the other hand, they remain fixed in class biased, far from ideal viewpoints that end up reinscribing the colonial encounter and fashion frameworks onto their sort of former claims. Um, so, but at the same time, I argue that these sort of the work that minimalist designers are doing to challenge perceptions and stereotypes about India while carrying out explorations and design innovations are critical to the growth and development of India's fashion industry and benefit its craft sector. Um, these irresolvable paradoxes then that emerge through either the sort of anti-colonial, pre-colonial references or references to sustainability are themselves very much part of what is the incomplete nature of the process of decolonization. And oftentimes, decolonial strategies are touted as a solution, but as we sort of explore them closely, we begin to realize that there is no pure decolonial past to return to. And within these strategies are still embedded a number of hierarchies and power imbalances that continue to make it an incomplete process. So, in closing, I guess it's important to also add one sort of final tension or paradox, which is something that I experience on a personal level, which is sort of attempting to critically analyze such fashion. Um, but also, on the other hand, my appreciation for the same, for clothing that is undoubtedly a pleasure to wear due to its design, its quality, attention to detail, and material properties. Um, and it sort of brings me to this point that academic research on contemporary Indian fashion, for the most part, often ignores the material pleasure or experience of wearing clothing. Instead, our focus has often been on identity management through sartorial politics, social inequities of fashion and craft. And so, in this sort of format, we still remain caught up in Eurocentric research methods that emphasize a researcher's maintenance of critical distance and discourages any attempt of being an appreciative critic or sahriday, um, someone who is deeply immersed in the fashion or design being examined. So I guess the sort of that's my kind of final paradox or tension with this work, is sort of this examination of minimal fashion and its many complexities and incomplete claims, and the wider topic of decolonizing fashion and its wasteful ways, but also one's own personal relationship with the same fashion, or more broadly design, and an appreciation for what it brings to luxury artisanal clothing and products. Okay, that sounds really abrupt, but that's all I have today. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to share this research. I'm happy to answer any questions or answer any questions via email at a later point. I have my email address in tiny font at the bottom of the screen. And I'm going to unshare. Oh, if I can find, oh, there it is. Stop sharing.
Yes, we saw your email address, Arti.
Excellent.
It was right there. Yeah, so Dr. Farjud is here, and then my friend Rachita is also here. So if Farjud or Rachita, do you have any
We're going to
questions?
force you to have a question.
I'm going to force you to have a question. Rachita, any question? One? Yes, please go ahead.
So, first of all, I'm very, thankful, and I'm very happy that you have included me as a part of this session today. It was very wonderful session by Miss Arti Sandhu, and India being the most rich with cultural heritage and lot of areas which were being discussed regarding the fashion industry and all that stuff. I was just thinking that perhaps my experience is coming from the part of the South Asia where I myself feel like in our events which are most celebrated events here in Pakistan especially, that we used to see a lot of embellishments in dresses, and we also see like things that by filling up the spatial values in design, it becomes a very lavish, luxurious, and expensive. Name it like on the wedding events, name it like on a special festive events where we are supposed to celebrate our cultural values. So my question is, instead of arguing about the minimalist approach in design, uh, can we ignore the embellishment and the filling out of the space with a lot of arabesque motifs, materials, which are surrounding all of the surface of the fabric, and which looks so expensive? And at times, we have a brand which is called Junaid Jamshed, which is promoting sort of a dress design, which is cultural, yet revamping, some sort of a way, finding out a pathway between a luxurious stuff and inculcating some of the elements from the craft and all that stuff. So what do you say about that, filling out a space with a lot of motives and design elements and making it look like so embellished as compared to the minimalist approach? So what is your take on,
Well,
would it be something to be noticed?
no, I mean, I don't think it can be ignored. And one of the things that I said at the start was that that was really the kind of fashion that I myself focused on in my initial research, the sort of couture. And I think it continues to, and in the beginning it served a really critical purpose because it was the most obvious way of showing a value, right? Value addition through textile craft. Um, but I think the challenge then, and again, all design, especially fashion, thrives on opposites. So when you have the ornamental style, you also by nature have to have something that challenges it later. And I've seen also, again, I'm not so familiar with brands in Pakistan, but we share very similar textile crafts, textile histories, and a number of emerging brands from spaces like Pakistan are doing the same thing, bringing forth a more minimalist aesthetic that still uses the same fabric or embroideries but in a different way. I think the I think sort of what's interesting to me is that the very ornamental design and the very minimal design, when you think of them conceptually, are doing the same thing. They're talking about culture, they're talking about, um, in one case, it may be sort of a metal thread embroidery that is fully covering a dupatta or a sari or a lehenga. But in the other case, it might be talking about a very unique style of weaving that takes many, many hours, or a very light style of embroidery. So, really, if you take away the aesthetic, the message is the same.
Mhm.
It's just harder for the minimalist designers because you have to work so much harder to convince a customer, especially a customer who will say, I mean, I don't even know how much a lehenga costs anymore in India. I think they're in the lakhs, maybe. These sort of, but to say that here you spent so many lakhs on a sari, you can still spend a lakh on a sari that has no embroidery on it. And what is the value? So I think both of these now coexist, make the same claims about craft upliftment, cultural identity, heritage preservation. Um, but they're also sort of trying to talk about make different tastes, claims about taste. And I think one of the things about minimalist fashion is that there is this sort of sense of that we are purer and more authentic. Yeah.
Just reading Rachita's message on.
Oh yeah, be lovely to catch up. I mean, Columbus is what, 2 hours? So drive down, or if I drive up, it'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks you. Thank you so much, Rachita, for joining. Really appreciate that. Yeah, yeah, you can visit. And like I was telling Arti that I would love to visit you too when I next visit Cincinnati, which is going to happen in another few weeks. I'll send you a note, Arti.
Oh, are you coming for an event or a conference or?
No, to meet my son.
Oh yes, you said he's at UC. Well, please, yeah, we should maybe catch up on campus and
Yeah.
whatever, how something should work out.
Yeah, but firstly, I have to tell you how amazing this lecture was. It was extremely enlightening because I mean, as Indians, we love to dress up, right? And we love fashion. We love to explore the maximum, and we also love to explore the minimum. But then in our minds, we have this preconceived ideas of like maximalism or maximum fashion is perhaps at a wedding, like how Farjood was talking about, or festivals, right? And then the minimum fashion or the minimalistic kind of fashion is more at the workplace. And then so we need to look a certain way. We can wear this like Zardosi lenga at work.
Yeah.
Then we can wear something like khadi or like the monochromatic kind of style at work and then still look professional and sophisticated and whatnot. So, but then I loved how you brought about because as you were presenting, I was like, oh, this is amazing, and then you were giving all that comparisons, and but then in the end, your paradox was just hit me hard in the sense like we needed to hear that paradox, right? So you're talking about simplicity, you're talking about like sophistication, and then neutral colors, and then like simple cuts, comfortable clothing, loose clothing, which kind of it's not really it's for all body types where we are
Hmm.
not really concerned about certain body types. People will look certain really well in certain colors because in India or even in South Asia, people have concerns about how complexion is perceived and whatnot, right? And here you're talking, and as you were talking, but then you also mentioned how price points, it does not really fit to a middle class budget at times. So then how do we, but then in the middle class mindset is like, I can pay so much money for the Zardozi weave because I can see that it looks expensive. But when I wear something that's kind of more, it might look classy and sophisticated, but when you wear maybe a costume or maybe a dress that's done with chikankari work, it looks gorgeous, but
Yeah.
then you're like, oh, am I justified paying this kind of money? So there is these, so I loved how you compared and contrast, Arti, and thank you so much for doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think taste making is such a sort of complex space, and there's a lot of theory on taste making, but you're right. I think about sort of even the mass manufacturing brands now. There's, for example, like West Side in India, where you can buy printed ikat or printed
Mhm.
jamdani for, I think it's 800 rupees for a kurta. And when you compare it to the fact that jamdani, the same jamdani, if you buy the fabric, is about 2,000 rupees a meter. And I say this because this is my, life cycle of looking for fabric, and I can make it at home for nothing. But this sort of, the complexity, because on one hand, we realize that there's this discourse around taste and taste about, khadi and handloom and these sort of beautiful weaves that take so long. But then you come to the reality that the price points are also so. And again, even within them, craftspeople are still struggling to earn a living. So, there's this sort of frustration at how expensive some of these things are when you use. I mean, I have a Jamdani dress that easily uses 10 meters of fabric. So you think about the math of that fabric, and that sort of 900 rupee West Side kurta. It's very difficult where on one hand, you're creating this sort of ideal around good taste, but it's always beyond the ability of a certain market to achieve it. And so they can never have that taste. Um, and in some ways, I think it is easier perhaps to get the Zardozi at a price point that is affordable, but maybe much, much harder to buy these sort of very fine chikankari embroideries because you can't copy it
Mhm.
authentically.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, this is amazing eye opener. Yeah.
Thank you. I enjoyed putting this together. It's a fun
I mean, in the past, in the
process.
past times, we have had um, uh, mostly graphic designers present, and then so it was
Hmm.
more visual kind of work, and then we had motion designers. But now talking and reaching and expanding towards fashion design as a part of Sadia, it was lovely. And then and I could see several similarities as you started off your presentation, and I was like, oh boy, this is so much like what we are thinking as well.
Yeah.
But then to have a fashion designer kind of decode and then talk about decolonizing, and then really the whole idea that we have as we perceive is like, oh, the maximalist kind of way of thinking, the more and more kind of thinking is very South Asian, right? And then you're contrasting it to minimalism as well, and be like, yes, this is South Asian as well, because we talk about minimalism as being pure, or minimalism as being authentic, minimalism as being simplistic, and minimalism as being like when we say one God, ek, like, and those things.
Yeah.
Then it kind of brings it all in towards a higher level. So when you talk about minimalism as being in a higher level and authentic, so it just hit me and be like, yes, this is amazing. Yeah. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to attending more of these.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Arti. We really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for Jude for joining us all the way from
I
Pakistan.
know it's
So
what,
late.
12, is it 12 o'clock, 11:30?
We uh, you want to unmute for Jude? You want to unmute?
It's 10 p.m.
Okay.
Sharp 10 p.m. 10.5 something from Lahore. So it's a wonderful time, and unfortunately, as you know, that internet service is very much busy in the weekend.
Yeah.
Is in this specific slot of time, and Ma'am Archana knows it very well because
Oh
we
yeah,
had
I
a very
can
tough time in
I
the
can
last.
relate to it because
So you
originally
can
I
recall
was
that, darling.
I was going to try doing this talk from India in October, and I'm so glad I didn't because I couldn't connect, and I was in
It's
Himachal at the
wonderful
time.
to yeah, it's wonderful, to attend such a enriched session apart from graphic design. Basically, I belong to graphic design, but
Hmm.
it was very fascinating and wonderful. And as Ma'am Archana stated that it was about the terms like decolonizing the design practice, what it is actually, and what sort of challenges we are living up with in 21st century. It was very enriching and a very fascinating and a very wonderful effort by Dr. Archana or Miss Archana, whatever she is. Sorry.
You can call me Archana. Yeah, but
Ma'am Archana.
thank you so
So it's
much,
wonderful.
everybody. Yeah,
Very
thank you
fascinating.
so much, everybody. I'm also looking at
Thank
time.
you, all of you.
Yeah,
So thank you so
thank you.
much. And then please reach out to Arti if you have any questions. And thank you so much, Arti, again for joining us.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank you. We'll meet
Thank
again.
you.
it. Yeah, thank you. Bye, Rachita. Bye.
Sure.
Bye, Arti.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.